What would you do if a politician promised you something for free and then within days you were paying more than ever? And then the President of the United States got involved? Because this is exactly what just happened in New York City. The story begins with President Donald J. Trump, the sitting president of the United States, and Zoran Mamdani, a New York City political figure who ran on one of the boldest promises imaginable: free public transit, free buses, free relief, no more fare pressure on working New Yorkers. And then, overnight, it collapsed. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, raised subway and bus fares from $2.90 to $3. There was no phase-in, no grace period, just higher costs days after Mamdani's promise. Now, this is when voters snapped, supporters turned, and suddenly this wasn't just a local transit issue anymore. Because when trust breaks this fast, it doesn't stay contained. President Donald Trump, he didn't miss it. He didn't brush it off, and he didn't treat it like some kind of a political noise, especially after threats, backlash, and public admissions started surfacing. So here's why this matters for you. If this can happen in the largest city in America, with cameras everywhere and promises made in plain English, it can happen anywhere. Well, tonight we're going to go ahead and break this down. How this escalated so fast, why voters feel played, and what happens next when reality hits ideology head on. Stay with me, guys, because this story only gets worse from here. Drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Okay, here's where the story stops being local. The story is not just about a fare hike. It's about President Donald J. Trump, the sitting president of the United States, watching a political collapse unfold in New York City fast enough that it demanded national attention. Now, on one side, you have Zoran Mamdani, who ran on one of the clearest, boldest promises imaginable: free public transportation, free transit, free buses, not reduced fares, not pilot programs, free buses, free relief for working New Yorkers. Anybody remember that? Drop a yes. Now, on the other side, you have reality, delivered by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA. Now, within days of Mamdani taking office, subway and bus fares jumped from $2.90 to $3. There was no delay. There was no cushion. No explanation that matched the campaign rhetoric and the campaign promises. Now that speed matters. It does. Now, this wasn't a policy debate stretched over months. This wasn't a gradual budget squeeze. This was an immediate contradiction. It was so fast that voters barely had time to process what happened before the backlash began. And so when something collapses this quickly in America's largest city, the consequences don't stay confined to City Hall. Now let's go ahead and strip the emotion out just for a moment, and let's walk through exactly what happened. So the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and not Zoran Mamdani personally, approved the fare increase. Now that part is true. The MTA operates under a state control structure, and the decision to raise fares was finalized before the inauguration. But here's the problem. Mamdani never reconciled. He campaigned as if the mayor of New York City could deliver free transit immediately without securing a replacement revenue stream, without legislative guarantees, and without even binding agreements with the MTA or even Albany or even Kathy Hochul for that matter. So when the new fare structure went into effect, subway and local bus rides rose to $3. This is a roughly 3.4% increase. Express bus fares climbed even higher than that. At the same time, the MetroCard phase-out accelerated, forcing riders into Omni-tap-to-pay systems. This is another friction point for daily commuters. Now, there was no mechanism in place to offset fares. There was no emergency funding. There were no executed tax changes, no bridge plan. That's the disconnect. You cannot promise free while the system that you rely on is legally obligated to raise prices and then act surprised when it all happens. So this is the moment that the tone changed, because for the people who voted for Zoran Mamdani, this wasn't just another policy disappointment, it felt personal. They didn't lose a theoretical benefit, they lost money immediately on something that they use every single day. Public transit isn't optional in New York City. It is groceries, it's rent, it's getting to work on time. And when fares jumped to $3 just days after being told free is coming, free buses are coming, it triggered something deeper than anger. It triggered embarrassment. People felt played. This is where the word scam landed once and only once, because this is how supporters themselves started describing it. Not critics, not opponents. Voters who believed the promise, they got scammed. And so they were told that the system would change for them. Instead, the system changed on them. And when the trust breaks this fast, people don't quietly move on. They turn, they post, they confront, they demand answers. And that reaction triggered something else, because now this wasn't just a transit story anymore. This is a credibility crisis unfolding in real time. And this exact situation plays out in another area of people's lives all the time. $89 doesn't sound all that dangerous, does it? Until it's every single month. And this is what happened to a retiree who thought that his coverage was fine. It wasn't. He was paying for benefits that he didn't even need. He didn't even use them because his plan was outdated. So when he finally added it up, it was over $1,000 a year, just quietly gone, out of his bank account, out of his wallet. So there was no warning. There was no alert, just resources bleeding out every single month, month after month. Now, let's go ahead and get on back to the story, because this is where it stops being just political fallout and it actually starts getting national attention. So this is where the national implications kick in. Donald J. Trump, he's not watching this as a commentator or as a rival from the sidelines. He's actually watching it as the sitting president of the United States, responsible for interstate commerce and federal oversight, funding, and even civil rights enforcement. New York City isn't just another city. It is the country's largest economic engine, a transportation hub, and a bellwether for policy experiments that other cities copy. And so when government breaks down this quickly, when public trust collapses overnight, it sends a signal far beyond City Hall. Add to that the intensity of the backlash, the rhetoric escalating online, and reports of threats tied to the fallout. And this stops becoming local politics. It becomes a stability issue. Presidents don't need to agree with a mayor to pay attention. They need to understand whether chaos is spreading, whether federal laws may be implicated, and whether intervention could become necessary. Now, Trump didn't insert himself emotionally. He noticed something structurally wrong, and he didn't miss how fast it was unraveling. So this is where it gets worse. As the backlash intensified, attention shifted from fares to legal exposure. So the U.S. Department of Justice doesn't step in over bad optics. It steps in when policies, rhetoric, or enforcement risk violating federal law. That's why the public warning from Har Dillon, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. This is why this matters. The issue was not about a 10-cent increase. It was about the direction of governance. Statements about taxing or targeting specific neighborhoods, talk of property seizure, and even administrative appointments with documented ideological views raise red flags about equal protection, due rights, and civil rights compliance. So when a city signals that certain groups may be treated differently in housing, transit access, or even property rights, that triggers federal scrutiny, period. And because New York City received massive federal funding tied to transportation, housing, and infrastructure, the DOJ has both jurisdiction and leverage. Now, at this point, the story officially crossed the line from campaign failure to potential federal oversight. Now, that's not hypothetical pressure. That is real authority entering the picture. Now, up to this point, Zoran Mamdani still had options. He could have slowed the rollout, clarified expectations, owned the mismatch between promise and the process. But once the DOJ warning entered the conversation, control slipped away, because now the narrative wasn't being written by his campaign or his supporters. It was being written by events. Every attempt to explain the fare hike, it sounded like deflection. Every reminder that the MTA controls pricing sounded like an excuse, especially after campaigning as if the mayor could actually flip a switch and change the prices and make buses for free. Here's the key part. Donald J. Trump didn't need to intervene. The collapse spoke for itself. The speed, the backlash, the legal scrutiny, the resurfacing statements, all of this together, they basically painted a picture of leadership that overpromised and underprepared. That's when authority evaporates, not through an attack, but through exposure. And so once voters feel misled and institutions start circling, momentum doesn't slow down. It accelerates. And this moment right here, this is where the slogans collapse and reality takes over. This is exactly why I talk so much about how things actually compound, not hype, not promises, results. And this is why I built a community the way I did. One of the first opportunities inside of the community is simple. Members can now earn by simply inviting others who genuinely want to learn about building and growing over time. Now there's no gimmicks, there's no pressure, just alignment. The entire group is built around the whole flywheel concept, compounding ideas, compounding growth, and compounding relationships over time. So when people win together, momentum builds naturally. All right, guys, so let's get back to the story, because from here on out, this stops being about messaging and actually starts becoming a lesson in execution. So this right here is exactly where the story picked up weight. So as the fare collapse dominated headlines, attention started to shift to Sia Weaver. She's a senior figure that's tied to Zohran Mamdani's administration, not because of a single comment, but because of a pattern. Old statements resurfaced, calling for the seizure of private property and framing home ownership as some kind of a tool of systemic oppression. Now, these weren't offhand comments or remarks. These were explicit documented positions that are aligned with the Democratic Socialists of America. So why does this matter now? Because credibility was already fractured. When governance falters, people scrutinize who's in the room making decisions. Appointments became signals. Ideology becomes policy risk. So this wasn't about relitigating tweets from years ago. This was about whether the values behind those statements were being imported into city governance at a moment of instability in housing, transit, and even public trust. So when those views intersect with federal funding, property rights, and civil protections, scrutiny isn't political. This is procedural. That paper trail didn't create the crisis. It magnified it. This sounds awfully similar to eminent domain, doesn't it? So then came the contradiction that made everything stick. Okay, reports started to reveal that Weaver's immediate family owned a $1.6 million home in Tennessee. This is a property that had doubled in value over time. Now, that fact standing alone isn't controversial. People are allowed to own their own homes. Wealth is not a crime. The issue was alignment. Now, you can argue for systemic reform. You can criticize housing markets. But when rhetoric condemns home ownership as immoral while benefiting directly from it, trust collapses. This wasn't a smear. This was math and public records. And at a moment when New Yorkers were being told to accept higher costs, tighter rules, and ideological experiments, that disconnect landed hard. Not emotionally, logically. There was no mocking needed. The contrast spoke for itself. Now, in politics, hypocrisy doesn't just undermine a message, it delegitimizes enforcement. People stop asking what you want to do, and they start asking why they should listen to you in the first place. And that's a very dangerous place for any administration to be. But at this point, it was very clear that this was never about buses. Transit was just the trigger, the first domino. What actually detonated was confidence. Confidence in competence. Confidence in honesty. Confidence that slogans were backed by executable plans. So once Zohran Mamdani's free transit promise collapsed in days, people stopped debating fares. They started questioning everything else: housing, taxes, property rights, eminent domain, enforcement authority. That's when the story escaped the policy lane and it entered into the credibility lane. Because if you can be that wrong that fast on your signature promise, voters don't assume the rest will magically improve. They assume the same pattern will repeat. And this is exactly why this traveled up so quickly. Not because critics amplified it, but because supporters recognized it. The disappointment wasn't illogical. It was practical. This wasn't Trump attacking Mamdani. This was Mandan's own narrative breaking under pressure in New York City on the biggest stage imaginable in the Big Apple. So this is why this matters beyond transit. Once trust is gone, no policy survives intact. And so here's the part that most people were never told. Free transit is not just a moral decision, it's an operational one. Someone always pays, whether it's the riders, the taxpayers, or service quality. So in New York City, transit already operates near capacity. Removing fares without replacing revenue, this is going to deliberately and directly increase crowding. It slows the boarding times and it extends dwell times at stops. More riders don't mean better service unless infrastructure expands at the same pace, and that requires even more money up front. Cities that experiment with fare-free models either limit their routes, restrict the hours, or offset costs with dedicated funding streams. None of that was locked in on here. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority relies on fare revenue to maintain service, pay their workers, and service their debt. Now, without a legally structured replacement, fare increases weren't a surprise. They were inevitable. Now, that's not ideology. That's just math. The promise wasn't rejected because people hate relief. It collapsed because the system that it depended on couldn't support it. And so once people understood that, the slogan lost its power. So here's what matters about President Donald J. Trump's response. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. Trump didn't need to pile on. He didn't need to tweet outrage. From a strategic standpoint, the contrast was already doing the work for him. One side promising sweeping change without securing the mechanics. The other side governs by pressure testing ideas against execution first. Now, as sitting president, Trump watches for two things: systemic risk and narrative signals. New York City's rapid breakdown sent both. When a flagship promise collapses in days, it tells you how future initiatives will fare under stress. This wasn't about personal rivalry with Zoran Mamdani. This is about a governance lesson that was playing out in real time. This is one that Trump has emphasized repeatedly. Outcomes beat slogans. And so when voter backlash, legal scrutiny, and administrative contradictions stack up this quickly, there's no need for theatrics. The opening is already there. Trump didn't miss this because leaders who deliver notice when promises outpace plans. Strategy isn't loud, it's patient, and it waits for reality to speak first. So this is the lesson that New York learned first, and the rest of the country is paying attention. This wasn't about left versus right, Republican versus Democrat. This wasn't even about Trump versus Mamdani. This is about results versus rhetoric. And more importantly, how fast reality arrives when promises aren't built to last. Now, New Yorkers, they didn't revolt because they hate help. They reacted because help was promised without a plan, and the bill showed up immediately. So when that happens, trust evaporates, authority weakens, and every other policy comes under suspicion. That's the inevitability here. Systems don't bend to slogans. Budgets don't obey applause. And governance doesn't forgive shortcuts. Cities across the country flirt with bold ideas. There's nothing wrong with ambition. But New York just showed what happens when ambition skips execution. This escalated fast because it had to. Reality doesn't wait. And now that it's out in the open, fare hikes and backlash and imminent domain scrutiny, there's no unringing the bell. New York learned it first. Others will learn it next.